How do you take a design and turn it into HTML and CSS? Now imagine you were given this design for a website and we're told to implement the entire thing from scratch, from the nav bar to this image and the font and the layout of this grid, even down here to the footer. Uh, if you don't have a good system, it might be a little intimidating, especially if you just jump into coding it. So instead, in this video, I'm going to teach you an approach that has served me really well as a front-end developer. And the trick is simple. We just break this down into smaller and smaller pieces or components. And for every new piece, you add a new HTML tag to represent it. So I'll show you an example of how to break a page down into smaller pieces in this video, followed by another video on how to translate it into HTML. So let me pull up a screenshot here and we'll just dive right into it. All right, so let's just dive into it. The number one thing that guides me through this process is that I start from the largest piece and just work my way down from there. And what's the largest piece? Well, it's the actual website itself. And while this may seem tedious, this points out that right now we're looking at a desktop site and not something like mobile, for instance. So here we got the overall website out. Now let's start working our way down on this header section. All right, now use a different color to represent that. So the header is pretty big, but we have some content right and starts right here, and it's offset just a little bit. You can see that nav bar kind of cuts off. You'll see this pattern come up a lot in websites, and that's because this area is likely a container. We'll go into what that means a little later. We're just going to keep breaking it down now. So we see next up is this nav bar right here. I'll change the color for you there. And the other area will be the rest of this header, which just has some simple text in it. So let's knock that out real quick. Oh, sorry, this preview thing is not as easy as pencil and paper, but I don't have the ability to record pencil and paper on me. All right, so let's take a look at what we just found out about this area just by breaking it down so far. We found out that it's a part of a larger container, that this container has two separate areas in it that take up the full width, the nav bar and this big section right here. And right in the middle, pretty much horizontally and vertically centered in the middle, is a piece of text that's likely an H1 or H2 tag for the website, right? And it's centered vertically and horizontally. This, just from boxing it out, we can already pretty much imagine how this might turn out, right? We have our body, which is represented by this big rectangle right here. Inside that, we have a div or possibly a header section if we're using semantic HTML. Inside that, we have our container, which is going to have some special rules for, how far into a div it wants to add spacing on the ends. And inside here, we have this shop regular grid, which is horizontally and vertically centered, probably in H1. You can kind of get the idea very simply of how that occurs in the HTML. So let's continue on with this nav bar. We have a title right there. We have a lot of space before we reach the actual nav links over here. Each nav link itself, and I'm not going to go every single one, we'll just take demos for instance. Each nav link itself is likely, say, a list item inside of the nav bar. And even inside this list item is the demo text itself, where we have the text that has a particular margin or padding around it to achieve its position in space. This is also likely a vertical and horizontal center, much like the shop regular grid right here. And of course, this would carry throughout the rest of the nav items here. And that's pretty much the entire header section. Now I'm going to leave this grid section to my students to figure out and get back to me on how they boxed it out. But I want to go over this footer section right here because there's some important concepts that show up. I took another screenshot of it, and we'll get started, of course, with the overall website itself. If it'll work for me. Oh, there we go. Right, so that's according to what my screenshot of what I cut off of the rest of the website. You can see once again that we have this very same padding in between, and even on the top, in between this text right here, or where all the content lies. And I bet you this is about the same distance here as it is right here, even though my screenshot might not be perfect there. And that's because you start to see a reuse of CSS rules spread out throughout the website. And you'll find that makes your life a lot easier when it comes to these sorts of things. Now, here's what I really wanted to show you is inside this container, we have this about section. Let me change the color. We have this about and get notified section. And you could probably tell by looking at it, but each side here takes up only half of its parent container. Let me even demonstrate that by boxing this around. Let's get halfway mark, changing the color. Oh, that's a little dark to see. We'll go with white. And if I copy and paste this and move it over here, it pretty much takes up exactly the same amount of space as this about section. And when you're doing development and you're thinking, okay, how do I lay things out? Well, this is where the grid system comes in handy. A grid system, for instance, Bootstrap's 12-column grid system, will likely say that this about section is 6 columns and this get notified section is 6 columns, and it resides inside a row. And that row will take up the full width of its parent container right there. And it'll lay things out perfectly to where it's just half of its parent container here and another half over here. So these are some of the concepts that sort of arise while we're looking into how to structure our HTML and CSS. So let me just finish off by boxing out the rest of it just to give you a good example. Clearly we have a text area here. This would likely be either a section or a div of some sort. And then we have our about header. Make that green. And then we have another section with a bunch of text in it, likely a paragraph tag. And that kind of comprises that area. Now over here, we'll see that this text area kind of gets started with a little bit of padding around it. And so maybe if you're speccing this out on paper, or what I would do if I was speccing this out on paper, is I would make note of the padding and margin that I wanted around this area. Right, so let's dive into the headers here too. We'll have the get notified part. Let me change the color to orange. Make that more obvious. We have another likely p tag for the text. And then we have another section down here for the email address input with the sign up button. And even inside of this, you would want a div to wrap it and then have the input area here. We'll make that, oh, I can't see that at all. We'll make that teal. And you'd have another section for the sign up button. And there would likely be some padding or margin governing how far this sign up button is away from the input button, or vice versa, depending on how you wanted to handle that. So you can see right here that we have specced out, we could skip this part. You generally get the picture right here, that we've specced out pretty much the whole footer And earlier we had, of course, the whole header. Now, when boxing these out, remember that this is for you. You don't need to be pixel perfect here. In fact, I usually do this on paper and just draw out the squares. The important part, though, is you start to pick up on patterns that emerge as you're boxing it out, right? You see here that, oh, there's a list. There's a list of nav items here. So that might go in an li tag, or go in a ul tag followed by lis for every single one. And inside that, you could have your ahrefs right here, right? So you can kind of feel out, and there are a bunch of different ways to approach that, but you can sort of get the idea of how this layout and design might happen. And there might be 10 different ways to do it, but you get the concepts behind it. And that's what's very important about this approach. And as I'll show you in the next video on how to turn this all into HTML, you can generally think of each square here as a div, a list with list items, or paragraph, or some other HTML tag. But more on that in the next video, where we turn all these squares into your actual HTML and CSS structure.